Hello everyone, welcome to Hill Street. Today's story is, I wasn't called, but I was still chosen. If you end up enjoying this story, please leave a like. If you enjoy hearing stories from me, please subscribe, become a resident of Hill Street. Let me know how I'm doing in the comments. Now, let's get to this nightmare. I grew up on Cherry Hill Lane, the street where girls go missing. It'd never been a big enough phenomena to catch the attention of anyone outside that tiny claustrophobic town, but the locals knew all of their names by heart. Catherine Randall in 28, Adelaide Higgins in 34, Joanne Barrett in 41, Evelyn Smart in 55, Josie Hank in 62, Elaine Richardson in 63, Rosemary Pick in 85, and my mother, January Patton, in 1994. Once a decade, like clockwork. There one day, gone the next. Nothing in common but the last place they were sighted along the bend of the lane. Most weren't officially considered missing persons. They were voluntary runaways, according to law enforcement. Women and girls who had every reason in the world to leave. A husband with wandering hands. Parents who couldn't afford to feed them. Even if the reasons weren't obvious. Well, living in the existential dread of a small town St. James was surely enough in its own right. Little Evelyn was the only one really looked into. They found her book bag discarded on the edge of the woods, stained with blood. Her school papers scattered the cement like garbage stained in the mud and leftover rainwater. That was all that was left of her, little scraps blowing in the wind. That was more than could be said for the rest of them. The town got used to absence. Little holes punched in our realities, covered up like a painting hung over a hole in the drywall. No one ever talked about it. No one ever speculated. Even ordinary death felt trivial in the wake of our shared and perpetual grief. I didn't cry when my grandparents died. No one else at the funeral did either. There were still some measures put in place for protection. Some small acknowledgement of what had happened. Sometime before I was born, the mayor had installed a bank of streetlights along the length of the lane. They glowed like warm flares throughout the evening. Kids didn't walk alone across it, especially after the sun began to dip and the sounds of the forest became pronounced and eerie. Women wouldn't even drive it after sunset. It was an unspoken rule that everyone buddied up heading to town events or parties. Do you ever wonder what happens on Cherry Hill Lane? I asked one night, voice a low whisper into the phone. Marnie had been smacked in the middle of describing the bitchy thing her mother had said that night at dinner, and my sudden question earned me a long beat of silence. I'd been perching on my bed near the window, gaze drawn slowly and surely, as always, towards the brightly lit street down the way. Usually, I ate my curiosity, buried it deep like I was supposed to. But as she talked about her mother, I couldn't help but think of my own. The older I got, the more her absence seemed to spread within me. Simon, she said, hesitant and delicate. I don't want to talk about it. Right, of course she didn't. No one did. Somehow, I was the only one who felt the wrongness of it all. Who wanted to acknowledge it? I better get going. Hey, Marnie's already quiet voice was tinged with something even more delicate, more wavering, pity. I didn't mean... It's fine, I muttered. I'll see you tomorrow. Love you. A pause. Love you too. I hung up the phone and let it fall to the windowsill. Outside, Cherry Hill sat as daunting and unchanged as ever, taunting me with the unrealized promise of a family, of a life I'd never have. I often wondered why my dad chose to stay after that, why he didn't pack up and move somewhere far, far away, unhaunted by the echo of his vanished wife, where the streets wouldn't whisper unanswerable questions into his son's ear, fester there until they erupted in tearful tirades over cold bowls of cereal in the early morning light. Maybe he really did believe what the cops had told him, that Mom had just run off. Maybe he just wanted to be closer to her memory. Honestly, so did I. But my bedroom window was never close enough. I waited until I heard my dad's soft snores drift in from his room down the hall before I nudged my bedroom door open and slipped outside. Practiced steps led me towards the front door, avoiding every well-worn creak in the floorboards and slipping the deadbolt open so slowly I could barely hear it release. By the time the night air hit my cheeks, my whole body was humming with adrenaline. I didn't have any delusion that I'd find her, uncover some clue every police officer missed the first time round. I'd been sneaking out to the edge of the woods for as long as I could remember, and any child fantasies of uncovering the truth had faded years ago. But those nights when missing her got the best of me, well, it helped me feel close. If my dad knew, he would kill me. The neighbors must have seen me from time to time, sneaking down the street under the cover of the moon. But just like everything else about the street, they must have been content to pretend I didn't exist. Just a few yards into the cover of trees was a large stone slab, laying like an altar among a small break in the foliage. This was my chosen spot. I could stretch out on top of it with a book or a notepad, occasionally just the accompaniment of my own thoughts, and sit for hours. I always came back to the same mental image as I sat there. My mother, with her long dark hair, shining like the sun as she grinned down at me. I'm not sure if it was a real memory or just some amalgamation my mind had made of the old photos of her I'd found buried in the attic. This particular night started the same as any other. I traced the grooves of the rock with my fingertips, breathing in the sweet fresh air and willing some sort of closure to wash over me. It seemed so close enough I could reach out and wrap my hand around it, but it remained elusive, just the same. Along with that always came a slow and steady discomfort in my bones. I knew I didn't belong there. I always assumed that had more to do with the town rumors, my dad's desperate insistence I steer clear of Cherry Hill. That night, I learned it was more. As I sat in limbo, trembling with the hopeless frustration, I was caught off guard by a large dark figure, bumping against my hand and then fluttering up against my cheek. I swatted the air, wincing and jerking back. A moth, I realized, barely keeping in the air as it dangled in the darkness in front of me. It bumped around blindly, but stayed close. Soon, it was joined by another, and then another. It must be the light from my phone. I pulled back from the growing mass. They didn't disappear or waver whatsoever. More joined, until they formed a quivering, pulsing ball in the air in front of me. With every swell, one or two would break rank and dart towards my cheeks. I scooted backwards until I slipped off the rock and hit the ground with a thump. The mass wavered and then flighted off deeper into the trees. I shouldn't have followed. I knew that. Even as I pulled myself to my feet and staggered off after it, I thought of the girls, the woman, my mother. everyone I had waiting back at home. And then I started walking. The woods were dark and muggy, and without a light to guide the way, they quickly transformed from inviting to menacing. Elongated shadows danced around me. Tree branches caught on my arms and legs. The uneven terrain below snagged my sneakers, threatening and occasionally succeeding in sending me sprawling to the ground. It didn't seem to matter that I struggled. However, the swarm of moths stayed close, the din of their ever-present buzz enveloping me in a gauzy, dreamlike state as I stumbled after them. Further we went, deeper into the tangle of trees than I'd ever dare venture on my own. Further, in fact, than I thought the woods could go. A mile or so, on the other side of the bend was a gas station, one of the only two in town, and the most convenient for my father to swing by on his way to work. I'd been there countless times, knew it like I knew every other part of this small town. I imagined a map laid out in front of me, stretching wider and wider with each and every step. Beyond that, my thoughts were comfortably numb, like I'd smoked a bowl and taken a Benadryl before I'd set foot out here. If I'd been thinking clearly, I would have turned back ages ago. Up ahead, two massive oaks stood vigil, noteworthy from the sheer fact of their size, in a way that even in the darkness, I could make them out perfectly. It was as if the stars were trained solely on them, the only thing worth looking at in the entirety of this cursed place. The moths came to a stop, hooving in the space between the trees, as if caught in a web. It was only then that I hesitated, that some measure of self-preservation kicked its way through the cotton filling in my mind. "What now?" it asked. The insects only hummed in reply. My idling brain didn't seem to communicate that with my feet. They carried on without it. Twigs crunching, arms shaking, I stepped into the mass of the insects just as panic started hooking into my brain. Everything went dark, the buzz getting louder and louder, peaking into an itchy, invasive crescendo as feather-soft wings battered my cheeks like machine gun fire. I gasped, trying to breathe in, a panic response that left me coughing and choking, as if the horde had flown right into my chest and kept right up with their frantic dance. I pushed forward, physically, mentally, as I felt more insects rushing me from all directions, wrapping around me like a web to keep me trapped in place. My head began to spin. Was I even still on solid ground, or simply stuck in limbo of this shaking, shuddering mass? Hand still at my side, I patted my pocket, reached inside. Even that small movement felt like shoving my hand through a pot of wriggling larvae. The inviolated fabric of my inner pocket was a strangely welcome sensation. I wish my whole body could crawl inside for protection. Instead, fingers brushed against cool metal, and I whipped my trusty pocket knife out and to attention. I thrust my arms forward with as much force as I could muster, and ripping noise stinging my ears, and making my skin ripple even further. I waved the blade wildly in front of me, muscles tiring, body screaming. A burst of air hit my cheeks, and I found the motivation needed to continue pushing. All at once, the mass released me, and I fell forwards, knees and palms scraping against jagged rock. I kept a tight hold of the knife, even as a sob of relief tore from my lips and echoed off the cavernous walls around me. That was enough to pull my attention forward, and my body unsteadily back to my feet. I wasn't in the forest anymore, at least not where I'd left it. I was in a stone tunnel, jutting deep and downward before me. A soft glow flickered from deeper down inside the stone mouth, dancing, wavering, jumping back to life. A fire. I spun around. There was just more tunnel behind me. Though that stretch was dark and unmanned, moss still speckled menacingly amongst the shadows. It's strange how quickly fear can fade and give way to curiosity. I've read that humans can accommodate just about anything given time. Kidnapping, starvation, torture. You hear stories of abuse survivors who didn't realize they were abused until years later. Despite countless broken bones and having to actively lie to cover up their abusers' misdeeds, I've never really understood that before, but almost instantly I knew I'd be marching forward, no matter what lay on the other end of that tunnel. I'd seen it through, pay the piper. It only took me seconds until I was descending the steep stone walkway, blade protectively at my side. More insects speckled the path, so still, I wasn't sure if they were drawings or live, hungry creatures just waiting to devour me. The light grew brighter, casting shadows of large archways carved in the stone at the bottom of the tunnel's gullet. From behind the doorway, more sound drifted out, a delicate layer of wind chimes and flutes. Something solid and steady at the back end. No, not instruments, I realized. Voices. Several set of lovely, delicately pitched tones joined together in shared revelry. And underneath, the buzz droned on like a bass line. The noise wrapped around me. For a flash, I felt surrounded again. But as air continued to expand in my lungs, my feet continued to forward, nerves steady. I reached the archway. Carved into the structure were a series of crude, deeply etched drawings, brutally dark pits of shadow that called to me. Moths, stick figures shorn to pieces, a jagged, oversized saw. My fingertips reached out and brushed along the edges, head tilting as if it were just another novel I was trying to read in the dark. Before I knew it, the singing had stopped, the buzzing as well. Following the source of light, I stepped into the cavern and turned to my left. I was greeted by a giant gaping amphitheater buried within the rocks. Its ceiling was so high it made me dizzy. Was I even still in the forest at all? How could anyone have missed this? What lay on the floor of the cavern was worse. My mind refused to see it, refused to acknowledge it. I clicked through everything else first. The high ceilings, the carving, the blood-smeared walls and flies. Finally, my gaze had nowhere to go but straight forward, my knees nearly giving out on me. A stone slab, not unlike the one I'd come to call my own up on the surface. 8 kneeling figures surrounded it, 4 on each side. 8 girls, all various ages, various complexions and body types. All of their hair was long and matted, and some trailing on the floor, some hanging at their lower back, but all caked in dark brown grime and knotted painfully. I recognized each of them. How couldn't I? Little Evelyn and her girlish round cheeks, lopsided smile. She hadn't aged a day since she'd been gone. Adelaide and her dour, tight-lipped frown. Her family had sworn in the press that she really was quite a happy girl, just couldn't take a smiling photo to save her life. Josie had worn giant hooped earrings while she disappeared, and one was still there, dangling merely. The other had been ripped out along with most of the lobe. Elaine had been crowned homecoming queen her junior year of high school, and the way the blonde frizz rose out of her scalp made me imagine she still wore the crown. Finally, There was January, sitting closest to me on the right-hand side, so clearly my mother, it made my teeth hurt, as if my body wanted to start all over from scratch, baby teeth bursting through my gums and tumbling to my mother's hand as she rocked me and stroked my hair, telling me what a big boy I was being. They were all looking at me, and they were all wrong. My mother was missing her left arm, Rosemary her right, little Evelyn had no foot, and Joanne's empty eye sockets stared out at me like darkened windows. Each was draped in loose white gowns, still stained from the initial injuries like a dark gruesome crust. They were arranged so they could still hold hands. The ones without legs were propped up by straw-stuffed rolls of cloth to keep their balance. In the center of it all, that rocky centerpiece, their rotting pieces were laid out with careful, loving precision, conjoined with tight black stitches. Its appendages were almost complete, but its eyes floated atop it like lonesome rubber balls. At first glance, it appeared that shadows had pooled in the center of the makeshift creature, but as the mass began to pulse, I saw it for exactly what it was, a swarm of moths. The women began to smile, the corners of their lips rising in tune with one another. "Simon," my mother said, voice clear and singular, even as each of the others mouthed the words right along with her. "You haven't been called." "You haven't been called," Eveline echoed, the beginning of her words overlapping with the tail end of my mother's. Josie chimed in next, then Adelaide and Elaine. "You haven't been called. You haven't been called." The ones with legs and feet rose gracefully upwards. The ones without shifted off their pillows using their arms and crawled to short rushes in my direction. One of the creature's hands twitched, then balled into a fist. "Mommy," I squeaked out, stepping backward. The words barely left my mouth before they were on me. I was surrounded again, quite physically this time. Hands wrapped around my wrist, pulled at my hair. I didn't have time to raise my knife before they were twisting my arm, pulling it from my fingers. Joanne reached out to swipe sweet-stained strands of hair from my forehead, drank in every dip and curve of my face like she was appraising a rare jewel. "We weren't prepared," she began, and each of the women echoed the sentiment after her. In tandem, they turned to look back towards the shuddering mass, paused, and gave one quick decisive nod, a peace. I kicked and screamed as they dragged me forward, pulling with every ounce of might I had in my small body. I was already hurt, already in shock. I didn't stand a chance. They came to a stop at the foot of the slab, the woman forcing me to my knees, jerking my head up and to attention when the smell of rotting flesh crawled its way down my throat and made me gag. "No," I said, warm tears splashing down on the stone. "Please, no." Evelyn circled around me, my half-dull pocket knife clutched in her tiny hand. The hands in my hair moved to clutch the side of my face, holding it in place like a vice. Joanne gripped my chin, squeezing each side of my mouth until my teeth rubbed my cheeks, bloodily, and I was forced to open wide. She gazed longingly inside my mouth, and then she smiled. "No, no, no," I repeated, a pitiful loop. One by one, the women started to sing again. Evelyn reached up towards my mouth. The makeshift body of the slab twitched, shifted, rose. Its makeshift limbs worked together to pull it up into a sitting position, yet the pieces were clearly moving separately. The mass of insects stayed clustered in its chest, with several loose moths occasionally breaking free from the ground and bouncing off of us. But it wasn't just bugs swarming in that pulsating black hole. Now, just a foot away from it, I could see something inky and black at its center. The bugs closest were stuck to it like it was a dark ball of gum, sticking them and then absorbing. "No," a voice said. A voice that wasn't my own. Part buzz, part deep baritone, decisiveness. Evelyn paused. Joanne released me. 2 rotted hands lifted to take her place. Its eyes still sat on the slab behind it, but I could feel them burning their way through me regardless. Its arms jerked back towards its body, pulling me along with them. The smell was unbearable, enveloping, punctuated by some alien sort of stench wafting out of the gooey mass. A foot of distance turned into an inch into a centimeter. The girl's hands stayed firm on my back, urging me forward. I took a deep breath, held it, and then darkness. Its black centered oozed around me, sinking into my nostrils, crawling into my ears. Molasses slow, it consumed me, pulled me deeper inside. I'd never be able to wipe it off my skin, I thought idly, resigned. Like adhesive left behind from a band-aid, it lingered on me long after it let go, till I died, maybe longer. It pushed into my eyelids, forced them open. It was somehow even darker, at least for a moment. A long forever moment that I was helpless to stop. And then it was over. Image flashed in front of me, rapid fire, so vivid I could swear I was in them. The wooden path I'd come from, a crumbling farmhouse in the distance, a screaming, flaxen-haired babe nestled into one-armed woman's chest, a patchwork man with a swollen, throbbing chest ascending wooden, rotten stairs. And then just like that, they came to a stop, and I was thrown back into a pool of darkness. I awoke 7 days later on Cherry Hill Lane, just a meter out from the tree line. "Simon?" said an unfamiliar voice, a hand gripping my cheek. "Simon, can you hear me, son?" "Is he all right?" That one was my father, voice unmistakable. Still my eyes stayed shut, convinced I was still in the darkness. A hand reached out and pulled at my lids, a blinding pin light breaking through my trance. The light stung like a bee sting. I was so grateful, so hungry for it, I began to cry. I was in and out of the hospital within hours. Besides a few cuts and scrapes, I had nothing to treat. They kept asking me what happened, but it was easier to lie and say I didn't remember a thing. In St. James, we get good at forgetting, ignoring the darkness. It finally occurred to me why. Life carried on surprisingly quick. I went back to school. I went back to calling Marnie late at night after our parents had gone to bed. I made summer plans with my friends and looked forward to my junior year. My trips to Cherry Hill ceased. I could hardly stand to bike down it in the light of the day. But still, it called to me, still lingering in my periphery like a warning, like a promise. One night, several months later, I glanced out my window to see a figure in white standing out from the trees, the empty sleeves of her dress blowing freely in the wind, matted hair, stained clothing, but a smile that could catch your breath from a distance. Rosemary, looking up at me through my window. I swatted at something buzzing near my ear, trying in vain to turn away, to forget. When she caught me looking, she raised her single hand and waved. The end. That was I wasn't called, but I was still chosen. If you ended up enjoying this story, please leave a like. I hope you all have had a great day, and have a good night.